Okay, welcome everybody. This is the Chapter 14 podcast on the respiratory system. We're going to look at the functional anatomy of the respiratory system by describing the role of the respiratory mucosa, IDing the organs of the upper respiratory and describing their function. We'll describe the structures and functions of the airways outside the lungs and the superficial lung anatomy. We'll describe the functional anatomy of the alveoli. We'll take a look at respiratory physiology by summarizing the physical principles governing the movement of air into and out of the lungs. And we'll describe the brainstem structures that influence the control of respiration and the effects of CO2 on respiratory rate. So if we look first at the functional anatomy of the respiratory system, that'll essentially encompass the organs that make it up and where they're located. And then in section 2, we'll look at how they work. So what is the major function of the respiratory system? And it's to get oxygen to the tissues so that they can make sufficient ATP to continue life function. In order to do that, they provide a large surface area for gas exchange between the air and the circulating blood. They move the air to and from the exchange surfaces of the lungs along the respiratory tract and protect the respiratory surfaces from dehydration, temperature change, and defend against pathogen invasion. They also provide sounds involved in speaking and singing and other communication. They aid in the sense of smell by olfactory receptors in the superior portions of the nasal cavity. So, briefly, if we want to understand the importance of the respiratory system, we need to look at how it is the cells generate energy. So the chemical equation for this is the formula for glucose, which is C6H12O6 plus 6 oxygens generates 6 CO2 and 6 water molecules and 36 ATP, which is the energy immediately available to do work. Without oxygen, so this is with oxygen, right, because you can see the oxygen right there. Without oxygen, we only get 2 ATP per glucose molecule. And the reason for that is that the chemical reactions that operate without oxygen are far fewer, and they produce far less energy than those that can operate in the presence of oxygen. So we have to breathe in order to get oxygen to the tissues in order for the tissues to be capable of carrying out metabolism using ATP as an energy source to do work. There are two different divisions of the respiratory system, the upper and lower respiratory. The upper respiratory system filters, warms, humidifies the incoming air before it gets into the lungs. If we didn't do that, it would damage the delicate lung tissue, which is designed primarily for gas exchange. It protects the sensitive lower tract as a result. It also reabsorbs heat and water in the outgoing air. The structures include the nose, the nasal cavity, the sinuses, and the pharynx. And if we want to diagram where those are, let's just sort of put a box around them here. You can see the upper respiratory here going all the way to here. Okay, so that's the upper respiratory. The lower respiratory moves air into the gas exchange surfaces and exchanges gases with capillaries. And these structures include the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles, along with the alveoli. And so if we wanted to diagram those in a box, we could do it like so. So there's the trach, right there, and larynx, and we go all the way down to the lungs. Okay, so that's the lower respiratory. The respiratory tract are passageways that carry air to and from gas exchange surfaces. The conducting portion runs from the nasal cavity to the bronchioles and conducts air to the exchange areas, while the respiratory portion is made up of the small bronchioles and alveoli, and this is where gas exchange actually takes place. The respiratory mucosa lines the conducting portion of the respiratory tract and is made up on its superficial surface of epithelial tissue. Underneath that, lamina propria, which is connective tissue. The epithelial tissue is special in that the type varies along different parts of the respiratory tract. It's pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia with numerous mucus cells in the nasal cavity and the superior portion of the pharynx, the trachea, and the bronchi, as well as the large bronchioles. Beneath it, the lamina propria is made up of areolar tissue that supports the respiratory epithelium, and we should also point out that it has numerous immune cells inside the lamina propria that guard against penetration by pathogens should they make it through the epithelial layer. Now, what is the purpose of the epithelia? Well, in these regions of the conducting division of the respiratory system, the mucus cells produce the mucus that traps the particulates. As a result, keeps them from getting down into the lungs. The cilia that are on the apical ends of these epithelial cells propel this pathogen-laden mucus up towards the mouth, where we can either spit it out or swallow it. In any case, it doesn't end up in the lungs, where it would produce a significant amount of damage. Very important to understand that. The lamina propria, of course, is designed to attach the epithelial tissue to the underlying structures and also to provide support for the epithelium. So again, connective tissue, its job is to act as the body's glue, and here it connects epithelial tissue to other tissues. The respiratory mucosa warms the incoming air. There's a network of blood vessels that radiates heat into the nasal cavities. It moistens this air as a result of the mucus gland secretions that humidify it, and it also protects the lower respiratory from chapping and damage due to the fact that it warms, humidifies, and also filters the incoming air. The delicate tissue in the lungs is not designed to withstand a lot of extremes of temperature or the invasion of pathogens. If we overwhelm it with these components in untreated air, the lungs would quickly scar, and this damage would result in a loss in compliance of the lungs, as well as a reduction in the efficiency of gas exchange. Cystic fibrosis is a disease that affects the respiratory mucosa. It's inherited. It's a deletion in a membrane pump that controls the distribution of salt across cell membranes. The result is that the salt accumulates outside the cell, resulting in the production of a thick, sticky mucus, which restricts airflow. This increases respiratory infection, and it also increases the risk of damage to the respiratory system. Breathing treatments will thin the mucus. We can test for the presence of this defective gene using amniocentesis before the baby is born, and thus prepare the parents to deal with the disease should their children carry 2 copies of the defective gene. In children, one of the ways that we deal with the damage of CF in the respiratory system is to hold the child upside down and percuss the back and allow them to cough up the mucus, which rapidly becomes infected with bacteria and very viscous and difficult to clear. As an adult, we can't do that, so we have a device called an ambivest that can take the place of performing this percussive activity, ambivest. And it looks like a life jacket, plugs into a power supply, and what it'll do is it'll rapidly beat and allow the adult to cough up this infected mucus and allow them to breathe for another day. Now, in addition to these treatments, we also use inhalers that contain an enzyme called DNase. which breaks down DNA. And the reason that this is effective in treatment of this disease is that the DNA that's released when bacteria die into this mucus makes it very thick and difficult to clear. If we break that DNA down, the mucus is more easily expelled in the child if we're doing the percussive activity, and in the adult if we're using the ambivest. There is no cure, unfortunately, for this disease, and it does affect the quality of life. Incidentally, the discovery of the gene responsible for CF was made at Children's Hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, from the nose to the pharynx, air passes through the nose first via the external nares and into the vestibule, which contain coarse hairs that can trap particulates. Then from there into the nasal cavity, which has a floor composed of the hard and soft palate. And from there, it passes through the internal nares and into the nasal pharynx, where it'll eventually enter the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx, and then it'll pass through the larynx on its way to the trachea, to the primary bronchioles, and then to the secondary and tertiary bronchioles, and all the way to the terminal bronchioles, which lead into the respiratory bronchioles, which lead into the alveolar ducts, from there into the alveolar sacs, and from there into the alveoli. The pharynx has three regions. The nasopharynx is the area between the internal nares and the soft palate, basically behind the nose. It's lined with pseudostratified columnar epithelia. The oropharynx lies behind the mouth, between the soft palate and base of the tongue, and it's lined with stratified squamous epithelium. And the laryngopharynx is the area between the hyoid and the entrance to the larynx and the esophagus, and it is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. And we should ask ourselves, why this choice of tissues for these different epithelial coverings for these different parts of the throat? Well, the nasopharynx is lined with pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Again, they contain cilia and mucus glands, and the purpose there is to trap particulates so that they don't end up getting into the lungs. The oropharynx and the laryngopharynx are passageways that are shared by both air, food, and water, and as a result they encounter significant physical trauma. So the stratified squamous epithelium is many layers of flattened cells, so it's a relatively tough tissue and less likely to tear. Thus, it's a perfect choice to line these cavities. In addition, we should point out that it is non-keratinized, which means that it's going to be smooth and slick, and it'll provide adequate lubrication for food and water to ultimately make it from the pharynx into the esophagus. When we discuss the digestive system, you'll see why that's important. Okay, from the pharynx to the primary bronchi, air passes through the pharynx to the larynx, which is the beginning of the lower respiratory system. It surrounds the glottis, which is a narrow opening that allows air to pass into the trachea. It's covered by a flap of tissue called the epiglottis, which closes when we swallow in order to keep food and water from going down the windpipe. This leads to the trachea, also known as the windpipe. And from the larynx, the air continues into the trachea. The trachea then branches into the right and left primary bronchi at a structure known as the carina. Okay, so let's indicate where the carina is. The carina is right here. Okay. And essentially what we've described so far is structures that are in the conducting division of the respiratory system. Basically a fancy pipe that gets the air down into the delicate gas exchange tissues of the lungs. Okay, the trachea or windpipe sits in front of the esophagus. It's about an inch wide, and it's held open by C-shaped cartilaginous rings, tracheal cartilage, that are bounded at the back by a muscle known as the trachealis muscle, which is a smooth muscle that can control the diameter of the trachea, allowing for constriction and expansion of the airway, again, depending on the need for oxygen. This also allows it to change shape when you swallow food and water so that they can pass from the esophagus down into the stomach. If these cartilaginous rings wrapped all the way around, it would occlude the esophagus and you'd be unable to get food into the stomach. It branches to form the right and left primary bronchi at the carina. Incidentally, if you're wondering what kind of tissue this is hyaline cartilage, a supportive type of connective tissue. Okay. From the bronchi to the bronchioles, the two primary bronchi branch into each lung. The right primary bronchus is slightly larger in diameter and has a steeper angle, while the left primary bronchus is more horizontal as it breaks off of the trachea. As a result, when sometimes food and water accidentally go down the wrong pipe, they tend to lodge more often in the right than the left bronchus, and there's a technique called the Heimlich maneuver, which you may have heard of, where we can use air trapped behind the food that's lodged in the bronchus in order to remove it from the area where it's wedged and eject it through the oral cavity and save the individual from choking to death. The bronchi branch into smaller tubes that are called bronchioles. From the bronchi to the bronchioles, we see smooth muscle tissue beginning to dominate with less cartilage. The sympathetic nervous system will stimulate this smooth muscle, and when this happens, it will engage in bronchodilation. The purpose being to increase the amount of air that gets into the lungs and thus increase the amount of oxygen that gets into the blood so that we can provide the muscle with oxygenated blood so that it can perform its fight or flight activity. Relaxation of the muscle increases the diameter and the flow. Parasympathetic stimulation results in bronchoconstriction, which results in the contraction of the muscle and decreased diameter and airflow. And so if you think about what the sympathetic nervous system is designed to do, it's designed to prepare you for a panic situation. So it has to fill the blood with nutrients and oxygen and get that blood to the tissues quickly so that we can fight or flee. And so bronchodilation is a natural outgrowth of that. As a result, we frequently give asthmatics inhalers that contain epinephrine in an effort to stimulate bronchodilation if they have an attack. Very important that they have that on hand, because if they undergo an encounter with their trigger and their airways close up to the point where they can't get air into the lungs, they could easily die. Asthma is an allergic reaction that results in extreme bronchoconstriction, usually via the release of histamine that promotes inflammation. It restricts or stops airflow, and it can be fatal. What you're looking at here are the lungs. The primary bronchi lead into the lungs. The right primary bronchus leads into the right lung, while the left primary bronchus leads into the left lung. These organs are cone-shaped. They're concave on their inferior portion, which rests on the diaphragm. The groove near the superior portion is at the hilum, and this allows passage of bronchi, pulmonary vessels, nerves, and lymphatics into and out of the organ. Each lung is divided into lobes. The right lung is made up of a superior, middle, and inferior lobe, while the left lung features a superior and inferior lobe. Both lungs contain an oblique fissure, while only the right lung contains a horizontal fissure. You'll also notice that the cardiac notch is found in the left lung to make space for the heart, resulting in the fact that the right lung has more surface area than the left, and as a result does most of the job of ventilation, while the left lung is there primarily to assist. The pleural cavities lie on either side of the mediastinum, which contains the pericardial cavity inside which the heart sits. The visceral and parietal pleura line the cavity and cling to the organ, the parietal pleura lining the cavity in which the lung sits, while the visceral pleura is clinging to the organ itself. And between them they have a pleural fluid that lubricates the lungs as they expand and contract so that we don't irritate, inflame, and scar the organ. The pericardial cavity surrounds the heart, and the pericardial fluid lubricates the heart as it beats so that it does not irritate and inflame and scar. Remember that all the internal organs need lubrication in order to ease internal movement, otherwise they'll damage themselves. And so we see these types of membranes clinging to the bulk of the internal organs for just that reason. Gas exchange occurs at the alveoli and also in the respiratory bronchioles and the bronchial sacs, and to a lesser extent in the ducts. Essentially, the thin layer of epithelial tissue is perfect for gas exchange. That eases the movement of oxygen from the air that you inhale into the blood, as well as the movement of carbon dioxide out of the blood and into the exhaled air. Each lung has about 150 million alveoli surrounded by capillary beds that look like clusters of grapes and are surrounded by elastic fibers that allow for expansion and recoil as the air moves in and out of this delicate tissue. And so you can see by the time we get to the respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar ducts and sacs and alveoli, the smooth muscle begins to disappear, and we essentially have epithelial tissue, a thin basal lamina, and then on the other side of the basal lamina are the capillaries, which are basically endothelial cells. And that means that the layer is very, very thin. And anything that interferes with the thickness of that layer, making it more thick, is going to impede gas exchange, and the result is going to be a problem with the efficiency of respiration. So conditions like pneumonia, pulmonary fibrosis, emphysema, silicosis, all of those conditions will tend to thicken this respiratory membrane and impede gas exchange and make it very difficult to breathe. It's one of the reasons, for instance, that smokers have a difficult time getting oxygen into the lungs due to the tar that coats the lungs, and also the fact that the tar causes the lungs to scar, and scar tissue is not ideal for gas exchange because of its lack of elasticity and also the fact that it's much thicker than the normal respiratory membrane. You also see a loss of alveoli when you look at the lungs of a smoker as well. Okay. Branches of the pulmonary artery bring deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs, and that's what the capillary networks around the alveoli initially fill with. This is where gas exchange occurs between the air in the alveoli and the blood in the surrounding capillaries. Branches of the pulmonary vein collect the oxygenated blood from the capillary networks and carry it back to the heart. And one of the things we have to appreciate is the fact that the heart and the lungs are very close to each other, and as a result the efficiency of oxygenation of blood is improved. It also means that the right side of the heart doesn't have to work against as much pressure in order to get blood from the heart to the lungs in order to effectively oxygenate it. And that's why the chambers on the right side of the heart are not as muscular as those on the left, particularly the ventricles. The alveolar epithelium lines the alveoli and allows for gas exchange. It's simple squamous epithelia. There are other types of cells in the alveoli, surfactant-secreting cells that generate a detergent-like secretion that overcomes the surface tension of the water that's in the lungs that would tend to make the lungs collapse. And alveolar macrophages, which phagocytize pathogens and debris and dying cells that would otherwise clog the alveoli. And again, we see the body's clever use of lymphatic tissue stationed in areas of the body where they're most likely to come into contact with pathogens. If we didn't do that, we would have massive infection. The respiratory membrane, as we discussed earlier, is simply the epithelial tissue of the alveoli, the basal lamina, and the endothelial cells of the blood vessels on the other side, the superficial side of the lung tissue. Oxygen and CO2 move through this membrane by diffusion. This is only a half micron thick layer And very important to understand that it's the extremely narrow nature of this membrane that makes it effective at gas exchange. Okay, when we talk about respiration, we're referring both to external respiration, which is the exchange of oxygen and CO2 between the body's tissues and the external environment, and internal respiration, which is the absorption of oxygen and the release of CO2 by tissue cells, which is then carried by the blood ultimately back to the heart, and from the heart to the lungs, and then the lungs eliminate it when you exhale. With external respiration, we see pulmonary ventilation, bringing air into and out of the lungs. This helps maintain alveolar ventilation, which is the movement of air into and out of the alveoli. Gas diffusion is the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide across the respiratory membrane here. And this also happens between the metabolically active tissues of the body and the capillary beds. This is how we pick up the waste gas CO2 and eliminate it from metabolizing tissue, and also how we deliver oxygen to that tissue at the same time. And then in the lungs, of course, this relationship is flipped. Oxygen tends to move from the lungs into the blood, while CO2 moves in the opposite direction when you exhale. And the reason for this, again, are the concentration gradients of the gases. In the lungs, the inhaled air has much more oxygen than in the blood that's coming to the lungs from the heart. And the situation is reversed for carbon dioxide. It's much more concentrated in the blood that's coming to the lungs from the heart than it is in the inhaled air. Impaired gas exchange can lead to hypoxia, which is basically a condition of low oxygen levels, and anoxia with no oxygen supply, quickly leading to tissue death. And the reason for that, again, is that without oxygen we can't make ATP. Without ATP, the cells can't perform any work. One of the things that we have to appreciate about respiration is that we're dealing with a gas when we're talking about air. Basically, it's a mixture of mostly nitrogen and then oxygen and some small amounts of carbon dioxide and other trace gases. And gas is one of the three states of matter, right? Solid, liquid, and gas. What differentiates the three states of matter from each other is the amount of movement of the atoms, the molecules that make up whatever compound or element we're talking about. Basically, in a solid, the molecules or atoms sit at fixed points and just vibrate, and as a result, a solid tends to maintain its shape and has very little kinetic energy. That's the energy of movement. In a liquid, it can form to the shape of its container, and as a result has more kinetic energy than a solid does. And of course, a gas has the most amount of kinetic energy because it'll reach all sides of the container in which it's found. And so one of the things that we can discuss are what the behavior of a gas is under different conditions. In a closed system, such as the lungs, a change in volume will result in a change in pressure. Increased volume will result in decreased pressure, because pressure is basically an assessment of the number of collisions that the gas molecules have against the sides of their container. While decreased volume will result in increased pressure. You can imagine, for instance, if you have a balloon, you squeeze it, eventually you'll get to the point where the pressure will be so high inside the balloon that it'll rupture. Okay, so you can sort of intuitively see that. So what we say is that pressure and volume are inversely related. But we should also point out that temperature has a role in this. Basically, the higher the temperature of a gas, the greater the pressure is going to be, and the greater the amount of gas, the greater the pressure is going to be. So there's a law that describes this called the perfect gas law that I just want to show you. And it basically states that pressure times volume is equal to the number of moles of gas times a constant times the temperature. Okay, and so what you're seeing here essentially is all of these effects contained in one. Basically, if we solve for pressure, we would end up having this equation. And so what we see is that as the volume goes down, okay, the pressure will go up. You can see that looking at this form of the equation. We can also see that as the temperature goes up, the pressure goes up. And we can also see that as the number of moles of gas goes up, the pressure goes up. Okay, so that's the perfect gas law. It takes all of those different gas laws and combines them into one. Changing the shape of the thoracic cavity results in a change in the volume of the pleural cavity. Increasing the volume occurs by contracting the diaphragm, which moves inferiorly, and moving the rib cage superiorly. And what this does is this takes the fixed amount of gas that's inside the chest cavity and causes it to occupy a larger volume. The result now is that the pressure inside the thoracic cavity will drop, creates a negative pressure or a vacuum, and because the lungs will cling to the sides of the pleural cavity, that vacuum will be translated to the inside of the lungs, and air will go from the outside world into the lungs, and that's inhalation. Okay. Now, in exhalation, what happens is that we relax all those muscles, the diaphragm, and also the other muscles that aid in inspiration, such as the intercostals, the pecs, the sternocleidomastoid, the latissimus dorsi, and the erector spinae to some extent. And when those muscles relax, what will happen is that the volume of the thoracic cage will shrink. That results in an increase in the pressure inside the thoracic cavity, and that increased pressure will force air out of the lungs as they recoil back to their original shape. The expanding of the thoracic cavity causes the lungs to expand because of the pleura and the pleural fluid. The parietal pleura is attached to the thoracic wall, and the visceral pleura is attached to the lungs. The pleural fluid forms a bond between these two layers, and the result is that we can translate now the change in pressure to the lungs themselves. If we have an opening in the thoracic cage, or if we have an opening in the lung tissue, the result is that air will fill the thoracic cavity and the lungs will collapse, and that's a condition known as atelectasis. And obviously, in order to fix this, we would have to evacuate the excess air in the thoracic cavity by sealing up the wound and then restoring normal pleural pressure. So here you can see how inhalation works. Inhalation causes the volume to increase. The result is that the pressure inside the pleural cavity decreases and air flows in, while in exhalation the pressure outside is less than the pressure inside, and that's due to the fact that the thoracic cavity is decreasing in volume at this point, and that forces the air out. So air always moves from an area of high to low pressure. The same is true for a liquid. Specific pressures that we need to deal with include atmospheric pressure, which is the air pressure outside the lungs, and the intrapulmonary pressure, which is the air pressure inside the lungs, specifically in the respiratory tract. The alveolar pressure is the air pressure in the alveoli themselves. So take a listen to the pressure gradients that govern ventilation.
When the diaphragm contracts and the rib cage swings outward, lung volume increases. The increased volume causes a decrease in pressure within the lung. As a result, air pressure inside the lungs becomes lower than air pressure outside the body. and air flows from outside the body into the lungs. This process is known as inspiration. The reverse occurs during expiration. The diaphragm relaxes and the rib cage swings inward. Lung volume decreases and the air pressure inside the lungs becomes greater than air pressure outside the body. Expiration then occurs as air flows down the pressure gradient from inside the lungs to outside the body.
What you're looking at here is just a plot of alveolar pressure during a breathing cycle. And on the right side, we have a plot of tidal volume during the breathing cycle, which is the amount of air that enters the lungs in a normal breath. Okay, so here you can see during inhalation, we reach a bottoming out of the alveolar pressure. Okay, this is as air is rushing in. Then as air continues to fill the lungs, what will happen is that pressure will begin to increase. And then when we exhale, the lung muscles of breathing relax, the muscles of inspiration relax, and the increase in pressure in the thoracic cavity will force the air out. Okay, and so we get to an alveolar pressure that's very high, and the result now is that the pressures or the volumes inside the lungs begin to drop. So what we need to do here is sort of diagram this out a little bit so we can understand what's going on. Let's do blue for the lowest alveolar pressure and the highest alveolar pressure, which are at 1 and 3 seconds respectively. And then let's diagram here where that is, right? There's 1 second. This is the same breathing cycle, and there's 3 seconds. And what do we see at the 1 second interval? We see the volume of air in the alveoli going up, okay, at 1 second, which makes sense because the alveolar pressure is dropping at this point. So that's pulling the air into the lungs and thus into the alveoli. And then over here, where the alveolar pressure is at its peak relative to atmospheric pressure, when the muscles of inspiration have fully relaxed, we see that air is rapidly flowing out of the lungs and the alveoli, because here you can see how the volumes are dropping. Okay. Shallow water blackout is the body's trigger to breathe that occurs when carbon dioxide levels are high and oxygen levels are different than they are at sea level. Hyperventilating before going underwater causes a decrease in CO2 concentration in the lungs. The levels of oxygen can drop enough to cause fainting or blackout before the levels of carbon dioxide rise enough to cause you to breathe. And so you don't feel the urge to breathe because your brainstem is getting the sensation that you're still in relatively good shape, okay, because the levels of carbon dioxide aren't rising quickly enough to trigger breathing. As a result, you can go unconscious. Okay, normally the trigger for you to inhale, chemical trigger, is carbon dioxide. As the carbon dioxide concentration increases, the rate and depth of respiration goes up, and that's again to eliminate the waste gas and to maintain a body pH between 7.35 and 7.45, and also an optimal carbon dioxide concentration in the tissues, and the two kind of go hand in hand. Okay, that brings us to the end of this podcast. Again, if you have any questions, be sure to let me know via email. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have, and I'll join everybody in the next podcast. Thank you for listening.